Alright, so the next thing we're going to cover is the skull, which is the beginning of the axial-skeleton. If you're looking on page 124 in your lab manuals, it gives the external structures of the skull. And it's nice and color-coded for you, which is nice. But, however, on the exam, you're going to be using these skulls that are given to you in the laboratory. And so this here is a fake bone, and you can tell that it's not a real skull because it's nice and molded and everything looks nice. This here is a more real skull, and you can tell that because you can see that we have teeth missing and different parts that are missing on the skull. The first bone that I want you to be able to identify is the frontal bone. And so the frontal bone here is like the forehead, okay? And then behind the frontal bone, you have the parietal bone. And so here is one parietal bone, and there's another parietal bone on the opposite side. So let me kind of turn this around here. Okay. So this is the back side. So you have the frontal bone, which is here. Behind there you have a parietal bone, and here's another parietal bone. Now, between the bones, you notice that there is this little squiggly line. That is called a suture. And so this suture that divides the parietal bones is called the sagittal suture. The suture that you see right here that separates the parietal bone from the frontal bone, that is the coronal suture. Behind the parietal bones, you have the occipital bone, which is located right here. And the suture that separates the parietal bones from the occipital bone is called the lambdoid suture. So that's a lambdoid suture. When we come around and look at the side of the skull, in this location here, this is the temporal bone. And I like to show the temporal bone on the real skull because you can just see it better. So just to get orientation, this is our frontal bone here, this is the parietal bone, and this is the temporal bone. And with the temporal bone, you notice that there is a suture that runs up and around. That's called the squamous suture. So it goes up and around and separates the temporal bone from the parietal bone. Now with your temporal suture, there are several structures I want you to be able to identify. This structure here is called the zygomatic process. So that's the zygomatic process. When we come down here, there's a hole there. That's the external acoustic meatus. And this little bone here kind of creates this little curvature here. And I'll turn around and show you on this skull here. So this little structure right here is called the mastoid process. So that's my mastoid process. And right underneath it, here's the external acoustic meatus, right there sticking down, that is the styloid process. Now if we turn and look at the back of the skull, okay, we zoom in here, this is your mastoid process right here. This is my occipital bone here. There's a suture, it starts right here. So here's the squamous suture, it comes around, it stops right there. The lambdoid suture comes and stops there, and there's a suture that wraps down and behind the mastoid process. That's the occipital mastoid suture. Occipital mastoid suture. Okay. And so those are the structures of the skull. If you turn your books, one more page here. Turn your books to page 128 in your lab manual. We'll go over the facial bones. So again, here's our skull. We have our frontal bone here. Okay. And then we have the nasal bone. So there's two little nasal bones. Between the nasal bone and your frontal bone, there's a suture. It's called the frontal nasal suture, located right there. These are called your orbits. So at the top of your orbit, there's a little notch there. It's called the supraorbital foramen or supraorbital notch. Either one will work. At the bottom of the orbits, you have two little holes here, and those are called the infraorbital foramen. So the little holes there are your infraorbital foramen. Now, as we look into the orbits, you see there's several little openings here. This one here at the top, everybody see that? This one here at the top, that's called your superior orbital fissure. This one here at the bottom is your infraorbital fissure. And then that hole that sticks right there, that's the optic canal. Now when we look into the nasal cavity here, we have this perpendicular plate that runs up the center, and at the bottom here, this is called the vomer. We have these little flaps that kind of protrude down. That's the middle and inferior concha. And this bone that makes the upper lip area here, that is called the maxilla. The cheekbone is called the zygomatic bone. Where the teeth meet the maxilla, it's called the marginal origin.